going to begin the identity section, chapter 3, section 1, with our reciprocal identities. Now, these are ones, guys, that you probably already know. The cosine's reciprocal is secant. The reciprocal of sine is cosecant. The reciprocal of tangent is cotangent. Secant then is the reciprocal of the sine. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Now, one way to keep that in mind is that S and C go together. Cotangent is 1 over the tangent. The other thing that you're going to do, you're going to put these in those 3-ring binders. It's a 3x5 inch bound 3x5 cards, and you can use those on the test. In terms of sine and cosine, tangent is the sine over cosine, and cotangent is cosine divided by the sine. When we are looking at our Pythagorean identity, remember the Pythagorean theorem says leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. In a unit circle, our radius is 1, or our hypotenuse is 1. In terms of sine and cosine, if our point on our unit circle is cosine and then sine x and y, then the values going up, sine is my leg, and then the cosine is my leg. Cosine squared of my alpha plus sine squared of my alpha is going to equal 1 squared. This is the first in terms of sine and cosine. I want you to pause the video and I want you to solve this equation for cosine squared of alpha, and then I want you to write it in terms of sine squared of alpha so that you have 3 of the equations in terms of sines and cosines. If I take this equation and I divide them both by sine squares all the way through and I simplify, then I'm going to get tangent squared of alpha plus 1 equals secant squared of alpha. And that's going to be the first. And I want you to pause now, and I want you to rewrite this equation, and I want you to solve for the tangent squared. And then I want you to get 1 on a side by itself. So you have 3 equations of the Pythagorean identity in terms of secant and tangent. The other thing that we have is the Pythagorean identity for the cotangent. If I would have taken and divided these original cosine and cosine by cosine squared of alpha, then I would have done my math and simplified and got 1 plus cotangent squared of alpha is equal to a cosecant squared of alpha. And that is the first of 3 equations. I want you to pause the video now, and I want you to solve for the cotangent, get it on a side by itself, and then I want you to solve and get 1 on a side by itself. When we are looking at rewriting the math problem in terms of sine and cosine only, what we want you to do is, this is a fraction. Cotangent, looking over at my reciprocal, is cosine of x divided by the sine of x. If I'm in terms of sines and cosines, I am dividing by cosecant, and cosecant is 1 over sine of x. Now, guys, this is a basic problem where you're going to go back and you're going to remember that a fraction divided by a fraction means that I keep the first fraction and I multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. Anything that's top and bottom, I'm going to divide out or reduce to simplify and get a final answer. The first thing I do when I see that I have multiplication and I have a tangent, I know that tangent is sine over cosine. Nothing else in the problem has changed, so I'm going to rewrite it all out. Cosine divides cosine as long as 1 cosine is in the numerator and 1 cosine is in the denominator. Then I have a binomial, sine of alpha plus 1 times sine of alpha minus 1. Back in Algebra 1, we called this FOILing, where you multiply the sine of alpha by both. Sine times sine is sine squared. Sine times a negative 1 is a negative sine. 1 times sine is sine, and 1 times -1 is -1, all divided by the cosine squared of alpha. Sine minus sine is 0. Those divide out, and that leaves me with sine squared of alpha minus 1 over the cosine squared of alpha. If you look back at your identities that I asked you to just do, this sine squared of alpha actually looks similar to something that you have in your second equation. And that is, these signs are the exact opposites. As I solve for cosine, my second equation was the cosine squared of alpha equals 1 minus the sine. Now, you should recall from pre-cal or your Algebra 1 class, college algebra class, that I can factor out that -1, which gives me 1 minus sine squared of alpha. And the 1 minus the sine squared of alpha is equal to cosine squared of alpha. Cosine divides cosine, leaving -1. Rewrite your cosine in terms of tangent. Rewrite cosine of x in terms of tangent.